Alright, so now that we have this cool looking creature body here, let's build some tentacles flowing off the back of this. Now these tentacles are going to be based on a circle, so I'll just display that and template the body here. In this circle we want to rotate it so it's pointing down the x-axis, so I'll just rotate that 90 degrees, or you could change the orientation, I suppose, and we'll move the center back like 20, and we'll set the radius a bit larger, set both radii the same, and right now this is a completely closed circle, but if we just change this to a polygon, set the arc type to open, then it's just going to give us this curve only. And now that we have this circle that we're going to, use as the base of our tentacles, we can copy some lines onto the points of this circle. So I'll just create a line, do a copy to points. The target points to copy to, the second input will be the circle, and we'll copy the lines onto that. But we don't want these lines to point straight upwards, so let's change them to point down the x-axis. And then we can set the length to be quite a bit longer. And right now this is only made of a start and end point, and we might want to have a lot more divisions on this, so you can just set the number of points on that line as well. And right now these lines are offset from that surface, so we can just move the center position of the circle back so that these lines are inset inside the body a bit. And this doesn't have to be super precise. We're going to do some carving on this curve in a moment to, specify exactly what portions of the curve we want to work with. And oftentimes when you're working with curves, you may want to have a UV value that specifies a 0 to 1 value on the UVs along the length of that curve. So let's just do that. You can use a UV texture SOP. Drop that onto the line, and the texture type will be rows and columns. So that'll just set the UV value, accordingly along the length of the line there. And now that we have our tentacle curves here, let's build some geometry on this. First, let's add some thickness to these lines here. We can do that with a poly wire, connect that to the curves, and let's just increase the wire radius a bit. And this is kind of low resolution, so let's also increase the divisions. And this doesn't have to be super high resolution. Remember that this is all going to be deforming later, so the higher resolution you make all of these pieces, the slower it will be to compute all of the deformations later. And as we saw in the last video where we built the main body of the creature, we're going to set a path attribute for each of the different sections. So I'll just set this one equal to creature/tentacles/tubes. And then we can move on to creating some pointy details on the ends of these tentacles here. And this is one way that the UV attribute comes in handy. And we can use this 0 to 1 UV attribute along the length of these lines to just isolate the points at the very end here. So let's create a blast SOP, connect that to the curves, and in the blast SOP we can type at uv.x equals 1, set the group type to points, and delete non-selected. And actually this is giving us nothing just yet because we missed one small but important step. Now on the UV texture SOP, this will default to creating vertex UVs. And this is typically what you would want for something like traditional texturing, but we're not really using this UV attribute for texturing. We're just using it for procedural modeling purposes, and we want this to be on the points instead. So change the attribute class to point, and then when you make that change, you can see now this blast SOP is working correctly to isolate the points at the ends of these tentacle tubes. So let's bring back this tentacle tube display and instance some pointy shapes onto the ends here. So once again, we'll just use copy to points. We'll put these points we've isolated in the second input, and we can just attach a tube shape to the first input here. And these are not pointing in the right direction yet, so let's set this to point down the x-axis. Let's make these regular polygons, and we'll make it a tapered shape by setting the radius to go from 0 to 1. And we'll give this a bit more height to elongate those pointy shapes a bit. And right now, this tube positioning is based on, this midpoint of the tube, the pointy tube that is, being attached to the end of these tentacles here. But I want this tube, if we just take a look at that, to sit at the origin instead of having the center point at the origin. I want the base of this tube to be at the origin for instancing purposes. Now, one way that we can do that is to take the height, copy that parameter, and paste relative references into the center X position of the tube. So that moves the tube 5.5 units in X, but that's too far. We only need half of that to keep the base of the tube sitting at the origin. So let's say 0.5 times that height parameter. And now, no matter what we set this height to, it's always going to have the base of this tube sitting at the origin. It's really helpful for procedural modeling purposes. Now let's display the copy to points here, bring back these tentacle tubes, and I think this is working just fine, but let's give this a bit more resolution. And I want these tubes to always maintain this perfect spiky shape whenever these tentacles are deforming. So, later on we're going to be adding some animation and some simulation to really kind of make these tentacles flow, but I always want to maintain this rigid shape at the end. And anytime you really want to maintain a rigid shape like this, it's very helpful to pack this geometry. And there are a couple different ways we can do this. You could just use a pack SOP like so, and that will ensure that, as this thing is deformed around, this always is just rigidly moved around and always keeps this perfect tube shape. Another thing we could do is we could cache this out, and this could be a little bit silly for geometry that is so simplistic like these spiky tubes. But if we cache out these polygons, and when we load it in, set it to load as a packed disk primitive, then this is once again going to be a packed object, and we'll take advantage of instancing at render time, assuming we tell the renderer to use that. And yeah, you really don't need to instance geometry that is so simplistic like this, but perhaps you want to do some sort of a more complex, high resolution type of detail at the end of these tentacles, in which case, some sort of packed disk instancing could be warranted, especially if you have lots and lots of these weird creatures flying around. And as before, we're going to set a path attribute on these spiky endpoints also. So I'm just going to call this creature tentacles ends. And then we can move on to creating some interesting segmented shapes along the length of these tentacles to really kind of enhance this biomechanical look. So let's merge together the pieces we've created so far. Let's template that. Now to create these segments along the length of the tentacle, I'm going to do another copy to points with another basic tube shape. So let's create copy to points once again, connect that to the tentacles, and this time I'm not going to just isolate the endpoints. I'll start by just copying these tubes to all of the points on those tentacles. So I'll just create a tube again, put that into the copy to points. And once again, all of these tubes are pointing in the wrong direction. So let's set those to point down the x-axis. Let's make them polygons. And we can increase the radius a little bit, like so. And right now, all of these tubes are overlapping each other. So let's turn down the height a little bit. And these are looking pretty faceted, so let's round out this shape some more with some more columns on that tube. And finally, let's add some end caps for this. And since we're copying these tubes directly onto the points on these lines, you can resample these points to control the spacing of these tubes. So when I drop that resample on, it has a very small length there, so it's creating tons of these tubes on top of each other. And it looks to me like value of 0.9 works pretty well for that length there. And we may need to do some trimming on either end of these tubes here, but we have to see everything in context before we do that. So I will hold off on that for a moment, and once again just set a decent path attribute on these tentacle pieces here. I'll just call these tentacles ridges. And now let's start merging everything together. So I'll drop in a merge, and we'll connect our tubes and the end spikes and these segmented pieces here. And then we can merge that in with the original body that we created. Let's connect the body there, connect the tentacles so far. And this is starting to look pretty cool, but I want to do something a little bit nicer for where the tentacles meet the body here. Right now they don't really flow into each other very nicely. Now in order to create some nicer shapes here, I'm going to once again base that off of the lines that we created. So let's template what we have so far, and let's grab a null connected to our curves and display that. And to isolate just a portion of these lines, actually I'm going to get rid of the template on everything else for the moment. We can use a carve SOP, and if you display that, this will trim the curve based on these UV values here. So if we drag the slider, you can see that's trimming back the curve here, but I don't want to trim it in that direction. I want to leave the ends that are kind of sticking inside the body of the creature. So we can turn off this first UV option, turn on the second U option, and we'll shrink this down to something like this. And let's zoom in on that, and then we can create some kind of tapered shapes on each of these lines. Once again, I'm going to do this with a poly wire. Can increase the wire radius a bit, give it some more divisions. And in order to create a tapered shape on this, let's create some new UVs. So once we've carved this line into these, shorter segments here, we have our UVs existing on this still. And right now it's within a very limited range from 0 to 0.043 on that UVX value, because that's what we trimmed it to with this carve. But I want to do a fresh UV texture to get a 0 to 1 value along this shortened length. So let's display the poly wire, and on this UV texture SOP, we'll set the texture type to rows and columns, and attribute class will be point. And now that we have 0 to 1 UVs on these short little lines here, we can actually use that attribute and the wire radius on this poly wire. So for the poly wire, I'll just use a fit function, and I'll say fit 0, 1, because we know our input is already in the 0 to 1 range. And we'll pass in the uv.x attribute, and we can remap that to a value of 2 at a UV value of 0. And then when the UVs are 1, we can just set a wire radius of 1. So that gives us these interesting tapered shapes like this. Let's also give these some decent normals, and that looks like it improves the display of those a bit. And as before, we're going to give this a path attribute, and I'll just call this creature body tentacle attachment. And then I'll merge this in with the creature body, like so. And then if we look at everything all together, we may want to tweak this a bit. And this attachment shape is helping out quite a bit, but it looks a little bit shorter than I would like. So we can go back to our carve here, and we can extend this a bit to make that a little bit longer. And then at this point, we might want to trim off some of these ridges here, maybe just this one ridge there. And we can do a similar thing when we're creating these ridge shapes. We can do an extra carve there. So for the carve on the line that's going into this creation of those ridges, right now that carve is way too much by default, but I'm just going to base this on the value that we used for the length of the attachment portion. So for the attachment portion here, we used a UV value of 0.06. So I'll do the same thing on this carve here, except instead of that being in the second U, I'll set that in the first U, so that one of those carves is trimming off this 0.6 range, and the other carve trims off everything on this side of that 0.6 UV value. So that makes, these ridges match up nicely with this tentacle attachment there. And I suppose if you want to go really procedural with this, you could copy that carve parameter from, this attachment portion, and then go to the area where we're creating the ridges. We can do a relative reference there. So now, as we change this carve UV value here, it's automatically changing where these segments are created, like so. Nice and procedural. And kind of similar to what I was saying about the spikes with regards to deformation, I don't want these segments to deform either. I want these segments to always maintain this perfect tube shape, regardless of how the tentacle is bending. So once again, you could either just pack these tubes before you instance them, or as before, you could do an actual cache to disk of this and load it as a packed disk primitive. Once again, might not be worth it for such a simplistic piece of geometry, but perhaps if you went with something much more detailed, maybe some higher resolution thing that looked kind of like a spinal vertebrae or something, then at that point it might be worth doing some more packed disk instancing for these tubes that are getting copied on here. And now let's just do a little bit of cleanup before we cache this to disk. I'm just going to keep everything nice and organized. These are my tentacles, and this is my tentacle attachment. And we may want to easily differentiate the tentacle geometry from the non-tentacle geometry later, so it's very helpful to set an additional attribute on each. So we can do this in a wrangle or an attribute create. In this case, I'll just do an attribute create. I'll set this to be a primitive attribute, and I'll call this tentacle. And let's give this a value of 1, because this is on our tentacles here. Rename that for clarity, and I'll copy that. And then on the body portion, I'll just call that tentacle 0 and change the value being written to a value of 0 there. And you'll notice that I'm considering the tentacle attachment as part of the body, because that makes a bit more logical sense to me, but that's all perhaps a matter of opinion. And I think we're all set to cache this to disk before we do some procedural animation on these tentacles. So when you write this creature cache to disk here, as usual for this sort of thing, make sure you're just saving one frame. And for the creatures, there's really no point in loading them as packed disk objects or anything, because we need to deform these creatures, as you'll see in the next video, and also when we get into the vellum stuff. So just make sure the creature is being loaded as regular geometry, and of course create a null so that we can refer to it easily in other sections of our scene. And let's do one last check before finishing up here. Just check those attributes and groups and everything on our cached geometry. And we do still have that UV attribute here. So we can just clean that up because I'm pretty sure we won't need that anymore. So I'll just drop in an attribute delete. And before I add that attribute delete, you'll notice that this merge is throwing a warning complaining about a mismatch of attributes. And that's not necessarily a problem. You'll see this happen all the time, and it's often totally fine. But sometimes it's a little bit cleaner to clean up your attributes so that they do match before merging them. So in this case, if we add the attribute delete, and then we delete this point attribute for the UVs, actually it's a vertex attribute at this point. We originally created point UVs, but this polywire process created texture UVs as the output of that SOP. So that's the reason that they're on vertices at this point. So we can just delete those UV attributes. And then let's take a look at the tentacle side as well, because that just addresses the body portion here. And on the tentacle side, we have a UV point attribute that we can clean up. So I'll drop in an attribute delete on this one as well. And this time I will select the UV attribute under the point attributes. Now if we merge the body and the tentacles together, you'll see we're still seeing an attribute mismatch. And in this case, it's because we have normals on the body, but we don't have any normals on the tentacle side yet. So we can just add a normal attribute here as well. Now if we look at the merge SOP, then our attributes and groups are all matching, and there's no more warning here. Like I said, that warning isn't really a big problem, but it does help you to stay aware of what's happening with those attributes. So we can recache this creature, and then we can move on to doing some procedural animation for the tentacles, and then start animating this creature along some paths as well.